In this chapter, we're going to use a MIDI keyboard to create a music track. I'm using an Axiom 61 as my controller, and some controllers also have internal sounds, like I have a Yamaha motif that has a whole bank of really nice internal sounds. And you may want to use those sounds. And if that's what you want to do, simply record yourself performing on a synthesizer. Then you would take the audio output of your synth and record it like we record other instruments like guitars and basses. And then you'd be creating and editing audio files. That's not what we're doing here. This chapter on MIDI is about using the keyboard as a kind of a typewriter. And we create a series of musical notes that we call a sequence. And once those notes are in Pro Tools, we can change the sounds that we hear, sort of like we change the font in a word processor, because the MIDI data is independent of the sounds and we can change one without changing the other. And we can do things with MIDI that we can't do with real instruments, like this. Try that on a piano. Now let me switch to a browser and show you that there are two ways to get MIDI data into Pro Tools. One is to use the 5-pin MIDI cable, and you connect the MIDI out of your keyboard to the MIDI in on your M-Box, or your O3, or your M-Audio interface, or whatever you're using. The other way is to use a USB connector. Some keyboards will output MIDI on both ports, the MIDI and the USB simultaneously, and some, like the Yamaha motif, have you choose one or the other. So I'm using the USB for the Axiom, but once you choose a method of input, there shouldn't be any difference in the data you collect. It's not like one really sounds great and the other doesn't. They should be the same. Now let me switch back to Pro Tools. When we recorded audio, we saw that we recorded frequencies and amplitudes. So what's in the MIDI signal? Let me create a MIDI track. Shift-Command-N, Shift-Control-N on a PC, and I will switch to MIDI, and notice that when I do that, the mono and stereo and surround options over here will go away. MIDI is its own separate animal. When we record audio files, we use sample-based timing, and now that we're in MIDI, we want tick-based timing. So I'll say Create, and I'll turn this piano off, enable this track. If I tap my keyboard, I see that it's receiving MIDI. If I don't see anything, then I want to go to Setup, MIDI, Input Devices, and make sure that my device is showing up and that the box for it is checked. While we're in here, let's look at Setup and Input Filter. This is where you decide what information Pro Tools will receive and record from your performance. And the default is all except these two. And that's a good place to start. You do want to record your sustain pedal, mod wheel, breath control, foot control, panning, everything except these two aftertouch parameters. So I'll close out of this box. I want to jump to the mix window for a second, Command equals, and look at what input Pro Tools is receiving MIDI on. So there's my motif. When that's hooked up, that's what I select. But it also has choices here for where it's going to receive MIDI data from. So choose the one that reflects how your keyboard is set up. MIDI is being received on this choice. MIDI is being sent on this choice. So right now my MIDI is going out of the connector on the back of the M-Box. There's nothing connected to it, but if I had a synthesizer, either a rack-mounted or another keyboard, I would patch into the output of the M-Box and be able to trigger that synth with the controller that I have set on input. The MIDI spec lets us send 16 discrete pieces of information over these various channels. So it's important to know which channel you're sending on and which channel Pro Tools is receiving on. So I'll leave that there. Let me scroll down just a little bit here. And the MIDI spec also uses a range between 0 and 127. So 128 discrete numbers, including the 0. And when I tap lightly, I see small velocities. And when I tap harder, I see numbers that approach 127. So you can't really peak. It limits out at 127 no matter how hard you hit it. But you can get very soft here at the bottom. Okay, now that MIDI is into Pro Tools, in the next movie we'll look at what we can do with it.